introduction. As Allison said, my name is Deborah Salons. I'm an attorney, and I'm also a certified information privacy professional. And I'd like to thank the ODCA for this opportunity, and I'd like to thank you all for coming to our panel today. So cloud regulation, what is it? When I speak to a lot of my lawyer friends, and I tell them that I'm researching cloud law, they ask me, what exactly is cloud law? And it's a really big question. It's just like defining the cloud at this point. There isn't a book that you can pull off the shelf that's titled cloud law. Especially in American jurisprudence, it's really a collection of a bunch of different laws and regulations, for instance, privacy, contract, SEC, FCC, FTC regulations, and additional things. And then when you add the international component on there, it gets a little bit more sticky. And then there's also the big data stuff that comes in, which consumer privacy regulations play a huge part in that. And then, of course, there's always the data breach, cybersecurity issues, which are pretty sexy and everyone likes to talk about, and they also fear. So today on the panel, we're going to discuss some regulations and also how the industry is accommodating and reacting to them. So I'd like to have our esteemed panel go through and introduce themselves.
So my name is Marvin Wheeler, and I'm the chairman of the Open Data Center Alliance, so happy to have you all here.
José González, I'm Chief Business Development Officer from Trapezoid Digital Security Services.
Brett Smith, Vice President of Security Governance at Deutsche Bank.
Aaron Duta, Managing Director, Financial Market Strategy for Cisco.
And Gordon Haff, Cloud Evangelist with Red Hat.
So we have a great group here. Just so you guys know a little bit about our panel today, I assume some of you have been to some of the previous panels where they have these interactive questions. And with this panel, we're actually going to have 2 questions, and we really need a quick turnaround from you guys because we really want to be reactive to what you guys would like to hear. So our first question is, which regulatory issue are you most concerned about? International relations and regulations and data sovereignty issues, consumer privacy considerations, and data breach cybersecurity regulations. So once we get your feedback, we're going to kind of modify the panel to address your top concerns. So if you could do that, that would be wonderful. And at this time, to give you guys some time, I'm going to ask Marvin, who's president of the ODCA, sitting there at the end, if he can tell us a little bit about his perception of your members' reaction and action to cloud regulations, and if the ODCA has a particular stance.
Yeah. So most of the work that was done on the working teams and with at the Open Data Center Alliance has revolved around kind of 3 basic layers of it. Is that first is to help member organizations and help the user kind of understand what the regulatory environment is. So what is the as is, what is what rules are in place, and so on. Because a lot of buyers, if you will, are not. They're not as familiar with what the regulations are going to be in a third-party cloud environment. The second thing is then to take that knowledge and be able to create documentation and things that from the working teams that the buyer can now go request. So now you're giving them more ammunition or more tools to go out and request these solutions that meet regulatory requirements. And then the third layer was that giving putting upon the provider to be able to demonstrate that they've met them. So it starts kind of the assessment side, being able to request the right questions and ask the right questions when they're in a buying situation, and then have the provider be able to demonstrate back that they're adhering to it, and have transparency for the user to see that these regulatory issues are being met as requested.
Can we get the results? All right, so it looks like data breach has definitely won the race here. So why don't we start off with that? Just as a general question to all the panelists, in your respective businesses and organizations, where do you see regulations come up, and what concerns do you have about these regulations in regards to data breach in particular? Any of you?
Well, I'll kind of start. This is from sort of the point of view of kind of a software supplier, open source software supplier, Red Hat. And we certainly see a lot of requirements increasing in multi-tenant environments in the cloud. Basically where different organizations may be sharing applications and data on a single physical server. So one of the things that we're seeing a lot of requirements for is implementing technologies that really keep those different data, different instances of applications from different consumers separate from each other.
Well, I'll pick it up from Cisco's point of view. I mean, obviously, as a network router switching company, we address a lot of the security issues much more at the much more lower levels, and then buttress that with a lot of the security and software with the around some of the things that you just responded to. But I think as it relates to cloud, you know, I spend most of my time in financial markets, so I deal with the exchanges, buy side, sell side, and the service providers to them. The regulatory issue are going to be much more stringent around where do you place the data, where do you do the processing, where the workloads are going to be allocated. And it's going to be a very interesting problem because we've got to go across multiple stacks to figure out where the breach points are going to be and how do you actually instrument towards them.
I think from our perspective, just the flexibility of the cloud services, they're so easy to get into, so easy to move from one service to another, that some of the inertia, I guess, that we relied upon before, if somebody wanted to open up a data center, move something into a data center before, it took some doing. They had to put in some orders and get some hardware moved and some cabling done. Now they can do it with an Amex and an internet connection. And so that's changing the world for us. We need different regulatory structures inside the bank, and we need to educate our users, and we need more partnership across the board, end to end, to get our arms around it. It's so flexible.
Well, what I was going to say is to wrap all of these together, what is becoming very interesting is the need to take and combine the operating system, the hardware, the regulatory policies into one consistent approach that reflects your security posture for your organization, not only where you currently operate, but in every location where you operate, and then layer in intelligence that allows all of that to respond to changes in the environment at a given moment. Because each of those, we're not even talking about breaches right now. We're talking just about changes in the location where the data may be housed can create as big a problem as a breach.
Right. And where the data is located, it not only does that create an issue as to where it's located, and that's a problem as big as the breach, but then there's also specific rules. And in the United States, bringing it back to breach regulations, in all 50 states, there are different breach regulations and notifications and whatnot. And Brett, I think maybe you can speak to this. What experience do you have with these data breach regulations where in all 50 states they're different and you have a breach, and how do you accommodate for that, and how do you react to that and make sure that you're in compliance with all these different rules?
It's a huge challenge right now. We have, we're working on our contracts. We're coming up with standardized contracts that address some of these issues. But when you think about what is a breach, different business lines will have a different definition of what a breach is. Different vendors will have a different definition of what a breach is. Some of the things that we're getting into with social media, the thing that the business wants to do from one perspective is exactly what would be defined as a breach from another perspective, right? So marketing can be defined as a breach, especially when you get into competitive marketing, right? When you're talking about your competitor's situation. So there's a lot of issues with what is the definition of breach, with the different states and nations, right? Different regulatory bodies around the world as well. Trying to keep track of who is in scope for which rule is interesting, because we've mentioned a couple times the idea of where the data resides, but it turns out that where the customer resides is a trigger for many of these notification rules, where the data is accessed from. So these are not just simple things of, oh, my data bits are here. It's where all these other factors come into play as well. There's going to be a lot of discussion, and then finally, one of the key issues that we've had in a legacy sense is when you're talking about security, you're talking about confidentiality, integrity, and availability is what we usually break it down to. Most of the breaches that we talked about in the past were availability breaches, where something went down and you knew that you had a problem because it broke. Somebody broke something, came in and took your service off the air. With confidentiality and integrity, it's not necessarily as obvious, right? So a lot of the breaches that we're seeing, we're finding out that they have a tail, that there's been a breach in existence for 2 years, 3 years, 4 years. So all of these factors are coming into play and changing the scope of the problem and forcing us to deal with the problem. I think earlier in the cycle, build the solutions into architecture and frameworks and APIs, as opposed to trying to layer security on top, because they're winning with that approach.
You know, one of the things too is that, kind of building on what a couple comments that all of them actually made, Aaron and Jose and everything, is that what we've seen is that, and it's to the point of multiple of states being different. I know that in Florida, where we were at, they have rules where once there's a breach, you have to pay the maximum fine as if everything in that particular database got breached, unless you can absolutely prove it was less than the whole. So our teams oftentimes would be called in because they were facing a $50 million fine. It was a large hospital in particular, because some patient information was taken, and they couldn't prove at first that only a small fraction of the patient's information was taken. So they had to pay a fine as if every single patient they had in the database was in fact breached. And then our team was called in, and they were able to go back through different things and logs, and as an expert testimony, go on behalf and say, no, it was this subset. And their fine was reduced from like 50 million down to a few million. And so what's happened is we learned that you better have everything properly instrumented, because on the occasion that something does happen, the level of problem you have, you're on the hook to prove that it was the minimum and it wasn't in fact the maximum.
Well, in fact, not just to Florida alone, but the SEC last year just provided some guidance. That's basically, if you rule it down to just a very simple rule of thumb, unless you can prove that a cybersecurity breach was not material, then you must disclose it. Doesn't matter whether it was 1 penny or not if you can't prove otherwise. So that's very big. I think there's a question.
Doesn't that prove to be a problem with cloud adoption? Because if you as an organisation have to prove it and you can't gain access.
Well, it's worse than that, because I think there's a technology architecture issue, but much more broadly, it's a business model issue. Okay, and when we talk about cloud, we don't talk about the implications of the operating model. Okay, and we need to start to talk that way, because it affects your policy, it affects your compliance, affects the regs, it affects how you monitor, how you chase things down. But more importantly, I think what it affects is there's a new set of economics, because it's a risk transfer. Someone's going to have to absorb that risk.
Yes.
Okay, and so if you think cloud is going to give you, let's say, a trade ticket or a currency pair match for a foreign exchange transaction, reduce the cost because you're doing much more OPEX, you're not owning the asset, it's not on your balance sheet, then all of a sudden you got to put these premiums, risk premiums on top of that. For certain businesses, they can no longer afford to do business. The economics will not work out for that operating model. So we just have to be very careful that we put the right context around breach, around security, and all of these things in totality are components to a new business design.
In particular example I was giving you, they were not even on a cloud technology. This was an internal issue that they had. So again, it goes, when you say it's just a hesitancy to adoption, it could be, but the reality is I'm not totally convinced that legacy architectures are any better, per what Aaron's saying. You know, in fact, you tend to be much more aggressive about forcing your third-party partner to be very compliant than sometimes you are to yourself. And so I would pose the argument that it's actually upgrading people's security, because it's easy for you to roll on your third-party guy. Your own team, you tend to, let's keep that over here, you know.
And I think that SEC guidance was to a company regardless of whether or not they're on the cloud or not, a breach whether or not you're on the cloud. So it's the same,
Exactly.
it's the same standard, and what's really interesting about that guidance is what is the definition of a breach. I mean, we come back to this again, it's all very fuzzy, and that's really a huge part of the challenge. But to bring this back to some more technical issues, I'd like to ask Gordon from Red Hat, does open source products face any additional vulnerabilities? And if so, is there a regulatory solution? Because when you hear open source, you kind of feel like it's open, it's not secure.
Well, you know, I think frankly, I think most enterprises are kind of over this at this point. I mean, I think the analogy that sort of the less sophisticated audience than what we probably have here, you know, a number of years back was sort of the analogy of, you know, not if you publish the blueprints for your alarm system, you're decreasing your security, which you probably are. But software vulnerabilities don't really work like that. I mean, in fact, most SQL overflow attacks and things like that are done without people looking at source code. They're just done attacking the binaries, and binaries can also be decompiled and so forth. But I mean, more broadly, I mean, you know, now does that mean that you can take any random open source software off the web, download it, and run it in your business and assume it's secure? Well, no. I mean, it's like any other software. So, you know, if you have software where security is important, you really do need to get from a trusted vendor who's hardened it, who has done code reviews, has done that kind of thing, and can promptly issue security patches, just like any other type of software.
Great. Now, just to kind of wrap up this portion of our discussion, I'm an attorney in Washington, so what's important to me is watching where the cybersecurity debate is going in Washington, and we've all heard about the leaks that are going on, and also there's been some things that have been released earlier this year where the government says one of our primary security concerns is cybersecurity. So I know that there can be sometimes a big gap between Silicon Valley and Washington. And as you guys as thought leaders in this area of cloud regulation, what kind of advice would you give enterprises or even developers or cloud service providers as to how they should get in and make part of the discussion, and how maybe ODCA can be a part of that?
Yeah.
Can I just quick, to trigger something? I think it's more complicated than Washington or Silicon Valley. I think introduce Wall Street to the mix, introduce Global 2000 companies. You have different sovereign nations, so you have different interests. Yeah, I mean, people are looking at China and other places as information warfare of the future, okay? So there's different jurisdictions, and so it's a very complex problem. I mean, when I spend some time with the Secret Service around these topics, it's like they have a saying, the bad guys get better over time, okay? And every time you think you catch them, somebody else pops up. So I think part of where I think the ODCA, you know, can help is that we do have an international, you know, community of practitioners, okay? And I think the way how it's set up, and I'm kind of new to this, so I'm expressing it from my new knowledge, more of what you and others have told me, so I'm kind of conditioned for the day. You know, we have worked on the ECLC, which is a sister organization of about 850 different Fortune 2000 type companies, okay, where there's tight collaboration around standards, around things like what we're talking about. And I think working with the ODCA, we're much more practical around generating requirements in this new world. The more collaboration we get, I think the better we'll get as far as maturing the right set of products and capabilities and solutions.
So if we haven't made it complicated enough with all the things, a lot of the things that's sort of an underline and kind of the white elephant in the room all the time is that if you look at the perpetrator of a lot of the problems, it used to be some hacking kid, it used to be whatever. Now it's bona fide, you know, a lot of times it was for commercial gain was the next step. And now the next phase is it's nation state adversaries, you know, where, you know, you're talking about you have a global organization and then individual countries have commissioned their version of the CIA to try to get trade secrets from their, you know, enemies / oftentimes partners, and so it causes a very, very different different paradigm to, you know, when you're dealing with it, is because the people that are doing it, the people that are coming in and actually creating a lot of the breaches they're not kids anymore, and a lot of times they're not even doing it for routine financial gain. These are very, very well organized. I mean, if you were to go in the rooms of it looks like a NASA knock in there, you know, of people that are very sophisticated.
Geopolitical motivations.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yep.
From my perspective, I think the paradigm is shifting. We used to go into a business deal with an RFP and scrutinize the vendor and come up with the cheapest quote. And I think that has got to change. I think we're going into long-term relationships with our vendors. We have to go in with the idea that we're going to be partners. We're not just going to sign a contract once and then walk away from it. The consequences of a problem with the contract can't be we're going to just fine you or walk away from the contract. We don't have the capability anymore. We're going to have to work through the problems together. Governance, being able to work with these issues over time as the problems develop, is going to require a lot of collaboration and communication between the vendor, the consumer, and multiple vendors, right? Because it's not just a two-party conversation anymore either. So I think that this whole model of an adversarial business relationship has got to change to be much more collaborative across a community. And I think that's where ODCA is kind of building the framework and the foundation for that to happen.
You know, it's interesting you just said, because Jose had experience, I know, in this from before, that then, to your point about contracts, because of the different regulatory rules, you can't have a contract anymore if you're a global company, because what's okay here for the FBI to be allowed to go in and seize data and so on, when you also have a location in Germany or you have a location in Spain or wherever, Latin America, it doesn't matter. There's all these there's different rules there. So sometimes, you know, it's creating, you know, just even our contract offices, you would end up having to have 6 addendums, one for each country, and so on and so forth.
Well, you know, there's a new movement and a new actor that's coming into this space. These are guys who are insurance providers, right? Because at the end of the day, cloud operating models are all going to be around service level management, right? And the contract is representative of the covenants of that service level, okay? But at the end of the day, how do you find recourse? And I joke around because unless it's defined, there is no recourse. It's just intercourse. Okay? Because what's going to happen is that, so one can imagine the reinsurance companies, the AIGs of the world who used to underwrite risk, okay, globally, can come into it and start to underwrite risk on service levels, because this is going to be, the economics are big enough where, you know, they will come into this space. I mean, I'm already seeing some players which I would never imagine a year ago.
Actually, that'd be a good business for
Well, you know, it's, you know, your tax dollars at work, my tax dollars at work. I'd love to see it be a good business and pay us back, you know. But the real point is that regular businesses and service providers like Terramark and others can't underwrite that risk anymore in that contract, and we have to work together to find a median ground, and there's a third party that's going to be involved now.
Well, I hate to jump in and interrupt the intercourse discourse that's going on here, but here's our next interactive question. It's actually asking you what the final question you'd like to hear our panelists address. But while you guys do that, I'm going to kind of go with more of a rapid fire, rapid answer style here, since we're running out of time. Now that we've talked about regulations, or at least the cybersecurity ones, just regulations in general, I just want to ask you guys real quickly what your perspective is as to how the industry is accommodating for them. And I put you in 2 groups, more of the technology standpoint and the business enterprise standpoint. So from the technologist standpoint, you know, how is the development of cloud technology reacting or accommodating to these regulations? And, you know, Gordon, can developers embed policies or tools in software? And Jose, I was going to ask you, how about hardware-based security architecture for cloud enterprises? So if you could give me kind of a quick reaction.
Yeah, so I mean, from a cloud management standpoint, I mean, the idea is basically to provide public cloud-like easy self-service in an enterprise context. And part of that enterprise context means embedding the policies of, for example, where the applications can run, where the data can be deployed, retention policies. So really, the key to having self-service in enterprise context in the cloud is being able to embed policies that include regulatory policies.
And then from a hardware perspective, I think if you, now that there is more and more availability of ways to trust the hardware, the signed fingerprints from Cisco, Intel TXT, various other hashes that you can use to identify the root of trust in the hardware. That's going to become part of the conversation. It is now becoming part of the conversation. As a result, all the breaches we were talking about, everything we've discussed so far, everybody's traditionally been looking at it at the operating system or at the hypervisor and above. Forget it. The landscape's totally changed. You're going down to the bare metal, and you have to take root of trust from the bare metal up in order to address.
And then from the business standpoint, the enterprise side, you know, what changes have you seen that are generally made to comply with cloud regulations? And I think that these questions probably directed to Brett and Aaron. What kind of business decisions and things have you seen?
Well, I think I mentioned briefly before the idea of getting the business to be partners with technology. I mean, we've talked about that for a long time. But now, if we're going to be successful in addressing the risks of this cloud enterprise, we're going to have to do that, to the point about addressing, you know, from the bare metal on up. If I have a cloud provider and I've got 17 business units that each have independent contracts and arrangements with that cloud provider without going through a standard governance practice, I've lost the battle, right? I just don't have, as an enterprise, a view of what's going on. So I need the business to step up and say, all right, we want to be in business, we want to work together, we want to address these risks, and I need to, on the technology or governance side, to provide them the ease of use so that they're not in a situation where they're trying to work around regulatory issues, not trying to work around security issues, but we've given them an easy path that meets and is compliant with those requirements. So I think there's a huge challenge, and as we build standard solutions, we build security into those standard solutions, compliance into those standard solutions. Business gets what they want, and by doing that, they're compliant. So I think that's where we have to go.
Yeah, I think that the most important thing is, you know, with cloud-based capabilities, you can actually monetize assets in new and different ways. So you got cloud, you got some of the mobile stuff, social stuff. So if I'm a wealth management organization and I'm building stuff, there's new delivery channels that I'm putting out to my financial analysts and their customers. And that's going to be delivered through whether iPads or whether it's through the iPhone and what have you. But most important thing there, I think, to consider is you can't compromise the experience. Make it easier, make it consistent for people to use this stuff, make it transparent. And I think some of the successes I've seen with Brett's Bank and others who have recently started to talk about this issue is that in most cases, I think it gave you guys an opportunity to really put security built in with governance and policy on the right up front rather than over the transom, right?
Yep.
And in some cases, it actually made existing applications and existing environments even much more secure than it was without going through this process.
Yeah.
Marvin, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, you know, look, it's I think Aaron hit the nail on the head there, is that there's two competing things going on here. One is that businesses have to get more aggressive and adopt these cloud technologies because their competitors are. So if one bank comes out and says you can do your online banking with your iPhone while you're, you know, at home, and the other one's not doing it, there's a competitive disadvantage. And if a retail outlet allows you to go through and scan your everything you're buying while you're in there, and you just walk right out the store at the end because it's already registered, they're going to have an advantage over the other one. So this is what the marketplace is demanding this, and then regulation all is going to have to eventually, you know, fit in. And I believe that, as what a lot of people here say, is that, you know, if your requirements are to be, you know, have high levels of security and high levels of compliance, you'll end up paying a little more. for that top tier deployment, but the convenience of what and the elasticity and the ease of cloud computing type technologies are just, they're not going away. And if you're a business and you say, well, you know what, it's not secure enough right now, so I'm not going to do it. You could be out of business. You're going to be, at that point, you're sort of arguing over deck chairs on a Titanic. You're going down the wrong path. You have to figure out how to take advantage of it, and as you say, partner with people and influence the right change.
All right, so I've got the results from the second question, and the final question that the audience would like us to address, and I think it's just kind of going down the line and just answering really quickly, is what cloud regulations do you find to be the most critical or important? And if you're going to ask me this question as an attorney, I would say all of them, but you guys have the special chance to kind of tell us which one you think is the most critical or important at this time, and where you think people should have their eye on. Want to start on this one?
Sort of what cloud regulations? I mean, we certainly have regulations around data, and we have various regulations around computing. I think if you kind of look at what might be coming, I think a lot has more to do with data. I think a lot will relate to sort of ambient data, who owns this data that sort of comes from all these sensors, and to what degree can that data be mashed up and combined with other sorts of data.
Yeah, I think that, look, there's a lot of international bodies that have already published papers and standards around this topic. There's a lot of smart people who tend to know what they're doing working on this topic. I think the biggest thing that I look at right now is the EU directives. Because you have many different countries over there who have very different requirements around movement of data, around storage of data, all the stuff that we talked about. And if you can get through that problem set, then we'll figure out what to do with India and Cambodia. Australia has a very interesting thing right now. Australia pretty much mandated as a country that they would favor everybody going into a cloud-based operating model. Okay, so that's kind of the Wild West, like what we had with trusted systems at DARPA 20 years ago. Okay, and then when you look at places like Canada and others, and then you can dice it by pharma has their regulations, and you have the healthcare folks with HIPAA, and then obviously banking and financial markets. We have probably about 80 different ways to describe this problem that people are putting standards around. Yeah, so there's a lot of work being done. I don't think it's hopeless. I don't think it's going to drive adoption in any way, but the economics and all the other stuff, the agility and all the other stuff that we talked about, we'll get through it. I mean, we have to try it.
I think switching the regulatory focus from objects to concepts and functionality is going to be the key issue. So when you start talking about data regulation, well, data is not an object. We talk about it that way, but it's not. It's not like an apple. When you take a chunk out of my apple, I know you've taken a chunk out of my apple. Not the case necessarily with data, right? We talked earlier about shared resources, right? A lot of the regulatory stuff says you must have dedicated resources for one customer. Well, I can dedicate resources logically, but I can't dedicate hardware physically, right? So I think the idea of regulating at a conceptual and functional level as opposed to a physical level is going to be a huge change and something that we need to partner with regulators now to drive that discussion forward so we regulate effectively.
I can't add any more to that. Data, the international balkanization of data regulations and the conflicting nature of that is, I think, fundamental to how we're going to proceed with a multinational cloud environment. And until that gets straightened up, cleared up with the work that Aaron noted is happening, we're not going to get the widest possible adoption that we could.
You get the last word.
Yeah, I actually, for the first time, agree with everybody. But it's, I think, too, on a more macro sense, I think that it's just indicative of what's going forward in a world economy and things like that, that I think the marketplace will kind of harness in a lot of these issues, because it will only be a matter of time before businesses just are not going to invest in their technology, in their development, and so on in countries that force silos. They're going to, today there's really no choice because, the cloud is in its infancy. But I believe that the multinational companies are going to want to do business in places that are the most favorable for them to be able to do business. And so little by little, there'll be certain, like you already see it in the data center world where some states will give cheaper power, so the data centers flood there. So the minute that some countries begin to be a little more, a little more accommodating in the regulatory environment, suddenly they're going to be a technology hub and others will follow suit.
The dichotomy, just a quick point on that, is it's very interesting because cloud is all about federation, right? It opens things up.
Yeah, yeah.
And as soon as you get into preservation,
You're right.
self-selection, you're out of the business.
Yeah.
Great. Well, it looks like we're kind of at the end of our time here, and I want to make sure that there's some time for some audience questions, but I would like to plug the ODCA resources and also the fabulous reception that's happening tonight. Be there or be square. The information is down there. So do we have any audience questions? Anybody? Well, I guess, yeah, it's the end of the day. If you guys have any other additional questions, feel free to come up to any of the panelists or myself. Let's give our panelists a round of applause. Thank you so much for coming.